Well, hi everybody, and welcome to this new episode of the Good Bloke, Not Woke podcast, where we really explore a variety of topics around healthy masculinity. Today, I'm really excited because I've got my first Kiwi guest on the podcast. So, Rich Ellis, referred to me by my good friend Christine Boucher, who's doing amazing work down there in southeastern Victoria and also right across Australia. And Rich is right there involved in the health coaching and the workplace health and well-being, running educational programs, supporting organisations to support their people to create greater health. He's obviously extremely enthusiastic about this area because he had a career change into this area some years ago, and also very heavily involved in, but since 2010, been running a men's swimming squad, which those of you who know me know that I'm a passionate swimmer. So much we can talk about. So, Rich, welcome to the podcast, mate.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too, mate. So, you've always been in Auckland? Are you Auckland born and bred?
Great question. No. I moved to New Zealand in 1998. So I'm originally from the UK. So you can't detect an accent?
I could. I just set you up, So what part of the old data are you from?
So grew up in the Midlands. I'm a Worcester boy, which is where the sauce comes from that nobody can pronounce.
Yep.
And that's how you pronounce it. And moved down to the southeast to study as a sort of teen, 20-odd-year-old. Lived in Wimbledon, which is a famous name in the tennis world, which people will probably know about. And after working for only a few years, had the opportunity of a job offer in New Zealand. And I probably need to give you the backstory before that, because the reason for that New Zealand connection was that my father was actually born here in 1945. And my grandfather was here because he worked for Cadbury's, which a name people will know. He was an engineer, and during his stint of setting up one of the Cadbury factories in Dunedin, the war broke out. And so instead of being here for a couple of years, he ended up being here for 10 years and was drafted into the Air Force to support the war effort out of Nelson. So they moved to Dunedin, up to Nelson, where my uncle was born in Dunedin. My dad was born in Nelson, but he was only 2.5 when he went back as a family to the UK. But those connections lasted, and both myself and my younger brother managed to take a gap year when we finished school, and did a year in Christchurch in a prep school as a general dog's body, sports coach, whatever was needed of us. And I kind of fell in love with New Zealand in that year. That was between sort of 1992, 93. And I sort of said to myself, if I ever had the opportunity to get back to New Zealand, I would. And it was only about 5 or so years later that job came up, and we moved here in 98. So we've actually lived in New Zealand slightly longer than we did in the UK. So we're proper Kiwis.
Wow. There you go. So, that's interesting. I mean, my son, Shane, he's 34, and his maternal grandfather was from Hawke's Bay.
Right.
And his maternal grandfather was what, 1/4 Māori. So what's that make my son? About 1/16, I suppose.
Yeah. He could qualify for the All Blacks.
Yeah, well, exactly. But he'd probably, play drums for them. But he, but yeah. So I mean, he's part Māori. I mean, you can't tell when you look at him, but. But yeah, so there's the connection. So just pick on what you said before. One of my favorite memes says the 3 things in the world that are hardest to say. One is I was wrong. The second one is I'm sorry. And the third one is Worcestershire sauce.
I love it. It's so true.
Yeah. So tell me about your work now, and what are you up to? What are you doing?
Yeah, so over the years, well, when I did that career change that you mentioned at the beginning, I got directly into the personal training space because I suppose it was a following my heart type decision. Really interested in health, always been active, was never the sporty kid, was never a top sportsman in any field, really. I could run. That was the one thing I could do well. I was quick at the 100 meters. but everything else I was always middle of the pack. But I would just, it was something that interested me, and I think some of that rubbed off from my parents, and over the years that evolved. So I wanted to learn more about health. Obviously, I was curious, I was hungry, I was ambitious, and so I embarked on the journey of study and finding out more about how the human body works, how the human brain works, providing me with more tools that I could then pass on to my clients, essentially, rather than just eat the right things and exercise more. Far too sort of simplified, I think, in terms of how we operate. And I think obviously most people can identify with that. Yeah. And so I've become a more holistic practitioner, understanding interpretation of bloods and just the nervous system, and slowly but surely realizing that what this was leading me towards was the health coaching side of things, being able to sit with someone, listen to them, ask the right questions, and be able to provide them the support and accountability they need to make their own journey towards whatever that health looks like. Yeah. And so I've spent as much time working in that sort of health coaching space now as I do in the movement side of things with people, because obviously we need to move our bodies, and I'm a firm believer, and that's one of the key components for that mental health piece. Yeah. But more and more with that health coaching, and then I sort of decided that I wanted to find a bigger audience. I wanted to have a bigger impact, and that's really where the corporate work kicked in. And I thought, well, surely these individuals work somewhere. I need to go to the place where they work so I can help influence everybody rather than just the individuals that I'm sitting with, day to day. And so I've done presentations to organizations, workshops, those sorts of things, which have been good and enjoyable and satisfying, but they're still a bit piecemeal. I think organizations sometimes still see it as, oh, we'll get so-and-so in to do such and such, tick the box, and then they can say that they've dealt with the stress issue, or they've incorporated well-being into the workplace, where the evidence doesn't show that necessarily has any long-lasting effect. And I think working in the coaching space, you realize that behavior change doesn't happen in 1 hour. Behavior change happens over a longer period of time. And so the desire to strengthen my offer and be able to provide something that's longer lasting was why I engaged with Christine, who we know, because she's been doing it for a long time. She's got all the right bits in the right places, and she's now able to, I guess, educate people like myself on what bits are missing from my offer so that I can do a better job, essentially. So that's what I do with my day, is there's a whole bunch of those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of things you mentioned there. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the fitness industry when I first came out of college. I was a physiologist, and the thing I presented at national conferences, and I even spoke in conferences in New Zealand, and I realized that in the fitness industry, and I still think it's there today, that if you've got 3% body fat, everything's okay.
Yeah.
That's a very cosmetic and very body focused attitude to well-being. But in the same point, I looked at workplace wellness many years ago, and one of the things that nobody could ever answer me around was, what about that person that smokes every day and drinks every day and doesn't eat that well and doesn't do any exercise, but they still live till they're 95? What's their secret? What's keeping them well? And we realize that the whole thing it's such a huge picture that we can either focus on parts of it, or we can try to expand out and see the whole picture. And I was lucky in 2005. I discovered the Avatar course, and I went and did the Avatar course, and I did the master's course, and I did all the advanced training. So I ended up delivering the course for a long time and kept doing advanced study. And I realized that consciousness is such an exciting playing field, because everything exists in there, and people create their own lives, and they create their outcomes, and they create their own experiences. And it's phenomenal when you start to work in there. You start to see what people are doing and how they're going, and what what they're really creating and manifesting, and it's an exciting thing. And I understand your desire to sort of reach beyond what appears to be obvious to find deeper answers. And the other thing that you said about the organizations and what they're prepared to spend, I reckon I call it budget anxiety. And it's a bit like the person who's got a fixed pay packet. They've got to pay their rent. They've got to pay this. They've got to pay that. And then they look at the gym membership and they ask themselves, can I afford that or can't I, And there's a lot of anxiety about squeezing it in because it doesn't have the same importance as the rent and the food bill and those sorts of things. And I think the same thing happens with corporations, Can we fit that into the budget, or is there something else more important? And because they haven't really yet landed how important it is. So and again, that's part of what's been created in consciousness. And it's, I wonder if you've come across any businesses that have got a bigger perspective and they see beyond that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's a good sort of comparison to people's psyche with the gym membership. It's a bit of an afterthought, or it's because it's one of those things that there's no immediate reward. It's the patience, it's the delayed gratification, right? And we know that that's an indication of intelligence, because the studies have been done, and unfortunately, if we don't have that quick result, some sort of identification of that it's working, it doesn't last. And that's why those gym memberships last for 3 months and people roll off and keep paying but don't keep turning up. And I think you're right, organizations probably behave in a similar way. I haven't come across many organizations that don't see it that way, but I think the difference for me is the people who have engaged me already get it. So either the business owner or the general manager, the decision maker, has either had a medical scare themselves and goes, I need to change tack, or they're already on that path, but none of their team are, or very few of their team are, and they just want to share that love with the rest of the team. They want them to appreciate the benefits of those things. So they are prepared to therefore invest and therefore put those programs into place. So that seems to be the common denominator for me is they're already a believer. And I suppose that makes my job a little bit easier. It's just convincing them that I'm the right person to be doing it for them.
Yeah, no, fair enough too. I've seen that certainly where the head honchos, almost met their maker and come back with a different perspective. And then, I also spoke with a guy once. He was the CEO of a very large corporation here, and we were connected through a referral from a friend, and I got on the phone with him and he said, "Yeah, what do you want?"
It's a great start, isn't it?
And I said, "Well, I just want to talk to you about the well-being of your people and their health, and educate them, prevent, disease, manage their stress." And he listened to me for a bit and he goes, "Listen, mate," he goes, "people who work here understand if you can't stand the heat, get out of the freaking kitchen." He goes, "So, whatever it is you're talking about, I reckon it's bullshit, and yeah, not interested."
Wow.
I said, "Oh, okay. All right, thank you." He was dead 18 months later.
Really?
Sudden death, heart attack. Yeah.
Interesting.
It was amazing. It was so sad that he was, not only was he blocking his people from that message, he was blocking himself from it, and it was, and it was a big, big company. And when a key person in a company drops dead like that, that's catastrophic for a company. And I have that conversation with executives all the time. I say to them, "Have you ever had a coronary calcium score?" And when they answer no, I say to them, "Well, how do you know whether you're 5 minutes away from a heart attack or not? What's your company's thinking on that?" You're a key person. You've got knowledge, you've got wisdom, you've got collective connection to the whole chain of process of this organization. If you disappear from the scene, that's a catastrophe. And so how come you don't know? But it's never been thought about, it's like, and I just see that as so irresponsible.
Yeah.
So interesting.
I think it's fair to say that even that medical test or assessment isn't even on people's radars. Like, it's just not in their vernacular. And, people have insurance for, death and disability. They have insurance for business continuity, for loss of income, all the things that could happen, but they don't do the one thing that prevents it. You know what I mean? Necessarily. That's a generalized sweeping statement, but you know what I mean?
So let's dive into that for a moment. Where do you reckon that comes from? I mean, like you grew up in England and you moved to New Zealand. I've grown up in Australia, and it's like this attitude of like, I think the only thing I insure is my car. I don't bother with insurance, and and I'm not big on home security or any of those sorts of things. I just don't carry those beliefs around with me. But then I know people have got everything insured, and I know people who are insurance brokers, and they tell me that the amount that people spend on insurance for things. And what is that? Where did that come from? Because we also know, don't we, that when people put in a claim, oftentimes the insurance companies fight like hell to not have to pay.
Yeah, they'll reject the first one.
Yeah, I mean,
to be honest, John, I don't know, but I suspect that there's a large amount of conditioning there. The way we've been taught to behave as a society is that we protect against the things that could happen, and this is how you do it, and that's it. And interestingly, I see AIA have been developing, or have developed, the AIA Vitality, which is very, very forward thinking, and not a cheap program to initiate, because it kind of goes against the grain in some ways, because it's encouraging people to be active, and it rewards that activity by giving you a discount off your premium. And I'm hands up, I'm a sucker for those sorts of things, because I just think it's the right way to behave. It's a responsible corporate citizen that encourages the people paying their premiums to prevent some of the things that they're insuring themselves against. So I think that's certainly a move in the right direction. And I think, that will improve and increase over time as the benefits of those. Obviously, there's a reward to AIA because there'll be less claims, and probably they'll make more money over the course of time. But to set something like that up is not cheap, in terms of the technology and behind it, the partners that are playing a huge role in delivering the rewards and so on. So the tide's turning a little bit, I think. But yeah, I think it's still that conditioning that's how society behaves. You pay your premiums, you get on with it, and you can sleep at night. But I think if we can be more proactive, we could probably go back to our brokers and say, well, actually, I'm doing all this activity, looking after my health, looking after my headspace. Let's get a discount on that premium, please.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? It's like, I've told this story on the podcast before, but I used to do a lot of training with a beautiful bloke by the name of Parker Neal. And Parker was a phys ed teacher. Parker's retired now, and he'd done a lot of triathlons and Ironmans and marathons, and he was always training. And he was one of those teachers that loved the kids with a rare fierceness, And he was always gruff with them, and he was always tough with them. But that's because he loved them so much, and he just wanted them to be great human beings. And I went out running with him one morning. We did this sort of like 15K loop, and it was just one of those mornings where it was just excuse my French, but it was a shithouse run. I just felt terrible the whole way, so it was just a struggle to not even stop. And we got to the end. I just said to him, well, thank God that's over. And he said, what, not too good today? And I said, no, it was bloody awful. And he said, yeah, it wasn't that great for me either. And he said, but you know what, Johnny, it's in the bank, son, And it's like, I consider those things, that the runs, the interval training, the swims, the push-ups, the, taking time to cook a really good meal with fresh produce, they're my insurance premiums, They're my insurance premiums, right? And I'm wondering what happened to that, where I can look at, a couple of my brothers, for example, they never exercise in any way. They don't do anything really to care for their mental health. And, you know, they're obsessed with their health cover, you know.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they probably should be, right? But, you know, it's like, what happened? And you must have come across people, because I know you're doing a lot of work with men who have woken up and said, you know what, shit, I need to take responsibility for my life. And I know you talked about the GM who's had the health catastrophe and woken up from it. But are you seeing much of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think COVID accelerated it. You know, I was literally talking to someone earlier on my podcast about how tough her business was, being open, being closed, being open, being closed, mental health. She was in fight or flight, constantly worrying about the finances. And I said to her, look, that's just one perfect example of what was going on across the country and most of the world, I suspect, you know, in greater or lesser, you know, extents. And the people that it's taken the toll on are the people that are the business owners, you know, the directors, the people that carry the burden, the ones who have to worry about making the payroll, and looking after their family and all the other responsibilities that come with that when business isn't going as straightforwardly as it normally would do. And those are the people that I'm seeing. Those are some of the people that have come to me. And I've got friends who you know, ended up in hospital as well as a result of that pressure, and fortunately came back out of hospital okay. But, you know, getting to that point is a hell of an indicator that things have gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that was a certain set of circumstances with the pandemic, but, you know, there's high interest rates, inflation, other things that come and go with high and low economies, and put people in those same situations, and those same people bear the burdens of those situations, and their health takes a toll, because that's the one thing that could actually help, but at the same time, it's a bit of time that they see needs to be put into their work endeavors, and just there's where that balance goes out the window again. It's a difficult one.
It is. It's so interesting. In fact, it's timely that you should mention that, because just yesterday morning I heard a report on the news. I listen to one news bulletin every day. I listen to the 4 a.m. news, just so I know what's going on in the world, you know, just in case there's been an earthquake in New Zealand or something, you know, it's nice to know better, right? And anyway, there was a report on there. There was some agency, I forget what it's called, but it's a federally supported agency for people to call when they're in financial difficulty. And they were saying that they're getting over 500 new calls every day. And they said, which is a huge upswing. And they said what they used to get was calls from people because they were in financial distress, because their marriage was breaking up, or because of some catastrophe in the family, or a business going broke or whatever. But she said all of the calls, all 500 plus calls every day, are about interest rates and cost of living increases, you know. And that creates enormous distress for people. And I've been in those positions in my life. I've been self-employed my whole life, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And I know what that is. And it's a real challenge for people. And I'm wondering, you know, some people cope with it very well. Some people, it really undoes them, you know, and they end up creating a massive fight or flight response to something that's never going to kill them, you know. And I'm just wondering, like, have you know, in your conversations with people, what are people saying about that?
I think they're realizing that the toll that the stress is taking on their body, and often there'll be other symptoms, there'll be other issues that come to the surface. You know, it could be skin related, gut related, you know, sleep related, whatever it might be. It'll be a secondary, you know, symptom from the cause, and that will make them stop and think. And that's where I come in and can help them through that journey. I'm reminded of pre-pandemic, actually, I'm reminded of working with a client who was in a very high-powered job, like number 2 in one of New Zealand's largest organizations, and just didn't really have enough time for himself. And it was clear he was a high performer, and did an amazing job, but that didn't leave much time for himself and his health. But came to see me, so I guess something had triggered that in his mind. But once we started working together. I certainly don't take any credit for this, but I guess it gave him a little bit of space to consider where he was at with things, and he actually decided to change jobs. So shifting to something similar, but not as high pressured, and there was a large amount of travel required as well.
Yeah.
And in this city, that's not much fun, because you can go a couple of kilometers in half an hour sometimes on a bad day. So
Yeah.
you know, you layer that into an already stressful job and a busy day. Yeah, it doesn't leave much left for the individual to look after themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I wonder whether, like, for a lot of men, there's a lot of humiliation associated with financial struggle, or feeling like if they're running a business, for example, and during the pandemic and struggling to pay wages and that sort of thing, and not wanting to fire people, and feeling like a sense of failure if they're not able to pull that off and really create enormous struggle. And I remember myself, you know, like when the lockdowns and all that came, my marriage had broken up a few years before that, and I just basically made a huge financial settlement and was looking at rebuilding. And the pandemic hit, and of course hardly got any work at all during the pandemic, and I found myself in a real financial tight spot, you know. And I remember, and I've done enough work on myself to not be reactive to that, so it wasn't interfering with my sleep, but I knew that I was stuck in a position of not really being able to get clarity on where to stand on it and how to build out of it. And my sister's a bank manager, you know, and so I just went and sat down with her and just spilled it all out and just told her where it was all at. God, it was helpful just to say it, you know. It was like just releasing the pressure valve, you know. And I'm wondering whether, I don't know, in your experience with some of the men that you work with, whether they're still sitting on that fear of the vulnerability of just saying, hey, this is where I'm at, and what that creates for them when they don't.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think they're ready to share. I mean, as you say, when you get the opportunity to sit down with someone you trust, and it can be like a coaching conversation, as the words come out, the relief comes with it. But I suppose you need to be in those situations where you feel relaxed and you're trusting, and building rapport with somebody over the course of a coaching program is very, very similar. You know, you're giving them that space to be able to share. And I think, in my experience, it doesn't necessarily always come out directly. It sort of can come out indirectly in other ways, the way things are said about other situations. And you know, the thing that springs to mind is one of the guys I'm working with at the moment. He has stepped back from his role, which was a senior role. I think that might be the guy you were referring to earlier, but he is building lots of opportunities for connection with his network, because he's got more time on his hands and is taking trips, and is using that connection to spend time with his mates, guys that he enjoys spending time with, people he respects. One happens to be a pilot, so he gets a good discount on airfares and they go visit places, you know. So I think behind the message behind that is that, you know, these are the sorts of conversations they want to be having, whether it's with me or whether it's with their mates, to process what's been going on, to ease the pressure valve, and to find a way of understanding what's going on.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it's like I don't know, part of the I suppose coming out of the Second World War and the rise of corporatism, and you know, and then through the 80s when we sort of got into that space of, you know, where the share market shifted from being a place where people invested into companies where people started trading to make profit and all that sort of thing, and everything became about building wealth. And it was a real shift right across the Western world in that space of creating wealth. And then it became this competition about being, you know, what have you got, you know, what have I got, or a perception of what you've got as opposed to what I perceive I've gotten. And that whole thing of then men sort of competing with each other, even when they're working in the same company. And it's like, I'm just having realizations while I'm talking here, okay? And it's like, instead of being comrades and friends and colleagues, they sort of became competitive with each other. Because I'm trying to feel for when was the time when men stopped just dropping all that and just being honest with each other. Because I remember, my first 7 years of life was on a cattle station and a dairy farm. And I
Right.
remember my dad standing there having a chat with the other farmers and talking about this and that and how tough things were or what wasn't working. And they're just honestly sharing with each other where they're at. They weren't competing with each other at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but so, and you think about I suppose the ultimate sort of Kiwi farmer, tough, grounded, earthy, just spade's not a spade, it's a fucking shovel, and just saying it how it is, and they're having that honest conversation. But then we move across into the corporate arena where we've sort of taken away the safety there. And I just wonder, what that's doing to the men and how the men who are in it can change it to make it easier for other young men, because it's not very honest. There's not a lot of integrity there.
No, it's not, is it? And I keep coming across articles that talk about their psychological safety. High-performing teams need psychological safety, and there's enough evidence to show now that the teams that have already got that psychological safety are the high-performing teams.
Yeah.
And it's not a new concept. It's been called something different, but it's that not having that fear of failure and allowing people to say what they think without fear of consequence. And I think the cultures, the corporate cultures, haven't allowed any of that psychological safety to become part of their culture. They've stuck to a very hierarchical, top down. This is the way we do things around here. If you don't like it, then where the door is type approach. And I think that's slowly changing, but it is a slow change. And I think you need those inspirational leaders to pick up the mantle on the newer way of leading and thinking, so that men do have that ability to be vulnerable and to share and let that sort of spill out, not just in the workplace, but into the rest of life. And I think probably, the pub is the obvious location where most of that happens. And the more beers in, the easier that conversation gets. But the sad thing is, we never remember that conversation the next day, and we go back to where we started the next day,
What's funny, isn't it? Because I think what you're talking about there in that hierarchical type thing is leadership via domination rather than leadership by inspiration, and I've got to admit, like probably 10 years ago, in my work in the Avatar courses, when you're exploring aspects of your own consciousness, you can dive in and you can discover gold mines where you can really integrate a lot of things. And one of the things I worked on was my tendency to dominate,
Right.
And like, even I remembered it as a kid, one of the things that was a hallmark of a footballer was a footballer who dominated the game,
Yeah.
It's like there was even a great footballer named Wayne Johnson here in Melbourne back in the 80s. He was called the Dominator,
Right.
And it's like,
you can't get away from it.
But it was really fun to sort of explore that and break that down and realize where I had those tendencies, so I could integrate them, and so they're not there anymore. But it's that I reckon it's a fear thing with those leaders who feel like they've got to control everybody, as opposed to fertilizing the crop and letting it grow naturally. And I don't know how that one changes or how we create that sort of change. But I feel like, we come back to, my initial definition, Rich, of healthy masculinity is to have a strong and robust moral compass, and then to have the courage to live by it. And I reckon a lot of stress comes when men make decisions that go against their moral compass because they don't have the courage to make the other decision, and so that chews at them and it interferes with their sleep, and it's perhaps the reason for their drinking or use of other drugs or those sorts of things. And I'm just wondering, it's like, you're a swimmer, you've had a squad running since 2010, and you and I both know if you're going to swim properly, it's going to be hard. You know, you got to go through a lot of discomfort when you're swimming,
Yeah.
especially if you're doing repetition 100s and 200s.
Yeah, they're brutal.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. There's a lot of very intense breathing at the end of a set, you know, and and you know, it's like, but you see men go through that time and time again to keep improving their swimming and their times, etc. Why is it that they can go through that, but they can't go through the discomfort of following their moral compass? And you
That's a
don't
great
have to have an
question.
answer to that, but I'm just interested.
That's a great question. It is a great question. The first place my brain goes to is they're prepared to endure the pain that they exhibit, that they put on themselves through the swim. Like they're prepared to endure that, right? But they're not necessarily prepared to endure the pain that will come with that wrong decision for not following their compass. And it almost may even be a way of transferring the pain, you know, beating themselves up in another way because they can't really comfortably do the other thing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. So the training
like
becomes,
of self-punishment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've probably been there, but yeah, I mean, it's yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's really, you know, it's really, really hard to stand your ground when what you're standing around for it isn't supported by other people. You know, you can find yourself out on your own, you know, and I mean, the world's full of people who did that. I mean, I think of Dr. Marshall over in Perth, who through his research team, they discovered bacteria in the stomach that shouldn't be there, that, you know, that shouldn't really survive there. And they got very interested in it, and he realized it was probably that bacteria that was causing stomach ulcers and not stress. And he couldn't get permission to do human trials on it. So he went, stuff it. And he poured a vial of the bacteria down his own throat, gave himself an ulcer, then treated it with antibiotics, wrote up the study, had it submitted for peer review, and the medical profession and the scientific community across Australia all but ran him out of town for being such a heretic, right? And he ended up being awarded the Nobel Prize for medicine because he dared question the narrative and ended up proving that stomach ulcers were because of Helicobacter pylorus bacteria and not because of stress, you know.
Right.
So there's a huge cost in standing up, you know.
Standing up, yeah, there is. I'm reminded of Bruce Lipton. You probably come across him. He wrote the biology.
I know Bruce.
Biology of belief.
Yeah. We were together last year. He's
right.
Yeah, he's a character.
Yeah.
Really, very passionate. Yeah.
Absolutely. But you know, his story is not dissimilar. You know, he was run out of his original university, and it wasn't until everybody caught up with his thinking that he was then invited, I think, to Harvard to continue his studies. And just another fascinating. There's a number of those, aren't there, through history where those who have strongly held beliefs hold on to them and are prepared to sacrifice all the things that are taken away. Until we get to a point where we've caught up with those geniuses.
Yeah, so true. It's such a fascinating area, and I get a sense, Rich, it is a much bigger part of men's overall health and well-being than we're paying attention to. You know, because at the end of the day, you know, when I go to bed at night, I've got to like myself, and if I don't, it's going to interfere with my sleep. I'm probably going to lean on, you know, consuming things that are not good for me, whether it's, you know, eating ice cream every night or drinking alcohol or, you know, smoking dope or whatever. I mean, I don't do those things, but, you know, but I know plenty of people who do because they're just trying to survive in the world. And here's the thing. They're blaming their job for their stress. And I reckon that is such a red flag, and that's something that we can really seize upon. You know, when we're dealing with men and they're blaming their job for their stress, that's such an incredible place to go, well, let's have a look at that. Let's have a really good look at that. I mean, why are you blaming? What's going on there? Because why are you in a position where you feel at the effect of your environment? Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
It is. And again, that takes me back to the whole, it's not what happened, it's how we react to it. And, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of those, it's not his concept. It goes back to the Stoics, doesn't it? In terms of Marcus Aurelius, it's not the event, it's how we perceive the event and what happens after that. There's a space. Covey talks about the space between the event and the reaction, and that's the thinking space where we've got that time to decide how we react.
Yeah.
And I think a large part of that, and this is one of the things I talk about when I talk about stress, is a large part of it is our map of the world, how we see things, how we perceive the event, and what meaning we give to that. And that comes back to Bruce again, of course, with his Petri dishes. The tissues in the cortisol withered away, and the tissues in the healthy serum were thriving. And that's what's going on in our bodies and our brains all the time if we allow it to. It's a self-education, like you were saying. It's a self-education, and when you've done the work on yourself, like you have, and you were talking to earlier, it gives you those tools to react to those things. So the people that say it's my work that's causing me stress, I'm sure there are lots of causes for that stress, but how many of those are you allowing to affect you in such a way that it's bad for your health, and how many of them could you dismiss?
Yeah, so true, isn't it? It's like I mean, Covey's work, you're right. I mean, he's really reciting what the Stoics were saying. And again, having done so much of the work in Avatar and integrated so much of my consciousness, I call it the cushion, that beautiful space between event or person or situation or happening or whatever, and then my response to it. So I've always got lots of space and time to just really be deliberate, make a decision about how I respond. So there's very little reactivity left in my universe. And because somebody's reactive doesn't mean they're a bad person. There's just more growth required. It's a bit like if you take a person out for a walk and they get to the 3 kilometer mark and they tell you they can't go any further, doesn't mean they're weak or they're a bad person. They've just got work to do. But it's like, where are we falling down that men are not stepping in to help other men to be okay with all that sort of stuff, to say, hey man, and you talked about the pub before, and I'm really interested in that. I was talking about it yesterday. I did some seminars for the Male Hug. The Male Hug is this amazing organization that's growing here in Australia, founded by my friend Tony Rabar. And it's all about helping men to remain mentally well, as opposed to rescuing men who have, we've got this beautiful 1-800 buddy line where people can ring up if they just want to have a bloke to talk to, And anyway, we were delivering some seminars for some managers of smash repair businesses. And we had about, 60 or 70 of them. And we're talking to them, and I was talking about how when you're supporting your team members, with men, you can't sit down and eyeball them. It doesn't work. Men don't like that. And I talked to them about how when I was 7 years old, actually, my folks got off the land and bought pubs. And so I grew up the first 3 years in a country pub in Queensland. And then I moved to Melbourne, and we were in an inner suburban working class pub until I was 17. In Melbourne. Right. And I remember clearly the blokes, when they were having those conversations, they would stand side by side looking out the window.
Right.
Their beers, not drunk or anything, but just talking, And one of the things I'm saying to men is, when you feel like there's something that's not right with your mate, take him for a walk. and have the conversation and ask him questions. Don't tell him how to be, ask him questions and start exploring, and all of us create interest, and that invites an opportunity to be a bit vulnerable, and get honest, I suppose. I don't know. It's you're seeing any of that in the space over there? Because Kiwis, I've always found Kiwis, people in America, because I spend a lot of time in America. My partner's American, and I've spent a lot of time over there. I've been there over 100 times, and my partner actually knows Stephen Covey, and people say to me, "What are Kiwis like?" And I said, "Well, they're Aussies without the ego."
I think that's a good description.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right about that conversation piece. I think that one works with kids as well. When you're stuck in a car, that's the best place to be having those conversations, right?
Yeah.
You can't get out, you can't go anywhere, and you're not looking at each other.
Yeah.
And I think it goes the same with the men's conversations, either in the pub, or for us, the swim crew, it's around the coffee table. But there's usually a small enough group that it's one conversation. Sometimes it might break into, two smaller conversations, or it might just be the guy sitting next to you because he's not quite directly in front of you. We're in an oval around the table or tables. And so it's more of a side-on conversation, and you get to know each other when you sit next to someone different each week, and you break down how the swim went, and what was funny and what was not funny, and who hit the buoy with their head, and who tripped on the beach, and who couldn't keep up, or who was going too quick, and all those sorts of things. But then you actually get to talk a little bit about them and find out about their family and what they've done in life prior to meeting them in the swim crew. And so those are really important conversations, I think, and that connection is probably why A, it's grown, but B, it's stayed together for so long. It's self-supporting because there's no rules around how we do things. Just because me and a mate sort of set it up, we don't really have to instruct anybody on anything. Everyone knows how we roll, and if you turn up, you turn up, and if you don't, you don't. And we have an awards evening during the winter to celebrate the winners and the losers, and it's just a really good get together, which sets us up for the next season. Going into spring, summer, for the next time we hit the sea as opposed to the swimming pool. So having those conversations, I think they can start in a much more relaxed way. But if it needs to, if someone needs some support, you'll quickly identify whether they do, because that's where the conversation will go. And if they feel like they're happy to share and they feel safe, there's that psychological safety thing. We'll trust each other. It's not like we're going to go sharing all of this stuff with the world. They're important conversations, I think. You make some strong connections.
So true, mate. I agree with you 100%. And you build a lot of trust in those groups. So I've got one question for you. What's the pinnacle? What's the toughest session you would do in the pool? In one of your pools?
In the pool, we're usually getting through about 2 to 2.5 Ks in an hour. So there's enough time to catch our breath, but not enough time to get into deep conversation. I think the hardest one I did was, I was moaning before we started, so I didn't have the right mindset going in. I think we did 2200s. That's brutal. And there was no variety. It was just 200, 200, 200, 200. It was brutal. So I have to say that was probably one of the worst or hardest.
There's a couple of times there some years ago where we did a bit of a pre-Christmas swim. Like the last swim before Christmas, and we did 5100s off 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's huge.
And it was just like, man, you just shut up and keep swimming,
Yeah. There's the incentive to go quick so you get more rest, but then of course you're blowing so hard you're not ready to go when the clock changes.
No, that's right. And swimming 100-meter intervals is a bit silly. swimming 200-meter intervals is just insanity, you know, and forget 400s. I mean,
oh yeah, horrible.
yeah.
I think I prefer the ocean more, even though we don't get a wall to push off.
Yes,
we
yeah.
we use the buoys. We'll go from buoy to buoy. We'll use the beach on a low tide, running in and out. Get some anaerobic stuff going. Swim round the buoys in case anyone does some competition type stuff, and then sometimes just a long hard slog out to the furthest buoy and back. So there's lots of variety.
Yeah, beautiful. Wow. Well, mate, one of the questions I ask everybody on the podcast is, who was somebody in your life that you looked up to, sort of had that very strong, really robust character that you trusted, that you sort of felt maybe you wanted to model, you know, someone had an impact on you?
I think the obvious answer is my father. In a lot of ways, I see myself in him in terms of he had a love for swimming as well. And he was quite active, big squash player, swimmer. Those were kind of the things that I remember, particularly when I was young. And I think a lot of that stuck with me, not consciously. I think I've gone to them over the years, and that's only when I stop and reflect and go, actually, there's a reason for this.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and he was a business owner and a leader, and you know, had a good way about him in terms of how he dealt with people, and was a considerate you know, employer and father. Busy, you know, not always there, but you know, that was for good reason, I suppose. So I think a lot of what he has done, especially in my younger years, were what's rubbed off on me in terms of steering me in the right direction and having a good moral compass.
Wow. Yeah, great question. Great answer, mate. Thank you. He must have been a pretty awesome bloke.
Yeah, he's good. He's turning 80 next year. So looking forward to hopefully getting over to somewhere probably in Europe as opposed to the UK, because I think he wants to take a holiday in Europe and celebrating with him.
Well, go for it, mate, and you know, see if you can build a bit of business over there, because like I've certainly been doing some business in Europe, because one of the things I realised in a lot of those countries, most people speak English.
Right.
So,
yeah.
You know, we English speakers are welcome over there, and to bring our education with us. So
yeah, great idea.
You never know. Well, Rich, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast and getting to know you a bit and hearing your perspectives. I'm glad that you're doing good work over there, keeping the Kiwis on the straight and narrow. And I'll leave you with my rugby union prediction that I've been giving to everybody, because there's some wealth going into Fiji now. There's a lot of Chinese money gone in there, and there's going to be a slow development of a middle class. So I predict that by about 2050, that the Fijians are going to take over from the All Blacks and become the dominant force in world rugby. Yeah, because you know, the thing that changed world rugby forever was when we brought proper conditioning programs into rugby, and the Polynesian boys started lifting steel.
Yeah,
like they're just so profoundly strong and powerful. But the Fijians will be able to match them with that, but they can also dance, you know. So
yeah, they got better feet.
So I think it's going to be very, very interesting, and the Kiwis might not like hearing that, but that's just my prediction. And
I like it. Like it.
But thanks so much, mate, and thank you everybody for tuning into this podcast. And remember, please try to be that person in your life that you needed when you were a kid and you were scared or you're in trouble. Take care out there.